2017 meeting of the Boulder Planning Board. Welcome everybody for joining us tonight. Our first order of business is approval of the minutes, which is super easy because we don't have any. The next item is public participation for matters not subject to public hearing, and we have two items scheduled for a public hearing. The first is a non-conforming use review at 802 16th Street. And then the other is the Fraser Meadows Congregate Care Facility at 350 Ponca Place and 4950 Thunderbird Drive. But if anybody has other issues that they'd like to address with the board, now is the time to do so. Cindy, do we have anybody signed up?
No, we do not.
Terrific. Would anyone like to address the board on issues other than those two public hearings? Seeing none, we'll move to the next item on our agenda, which is discussion of dispositions, call-ups, and continuations, and we have a bounty of those today. We have 6 in total. Does anybody have questions, comments, or would like to call any of those up? Go ahead, Crystal.
I have a question. So on F, amendment to approve site plan, it's for Western Industrial Park. When we approved that, I believe we approved it at site review with a condition about the height that the design would come back to, I believe, this board. So does that negate that in any way?
No, it does not. It doesn't affect the height modification that was granted, and they would still need to do an amendment.
I believe when it was granted with a condition that it come back with more detailed design.
That's right. The board drafted a condition that said the 55-foot height is approved, but that if there is, but final architectural plans were still subject to site review approval. And I think it was actually crafted in a way that would allow the planning department make the call and then subject to planning board call-up. But that particular portion was not part of this amendment.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Seeing none, I think we can move on to Agenda 5A, which is our first public hearing, which is a public hearing in consideration of a non-conforming use review for the addition of habitable space with 1 bedroom in the attic and conversion of an existing recreation room into a bedroom within an existing non-conforming duplex at 802 16th Street. Case number LUR 2017-00003.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Board. I will turn it over to Sloan Walbert, who's the case manager, who will take you through the staff analysis.
Good evening, everybody. So, as you said, the application before you is a non-conforming use review. And just as a little overview, I will cover the review process and criteria in the land use code, the existing context and history of the site, overview of the proposal, analysis of one key issue identified by staff, and we'll end with a recommendation. So just in terms of process, the existing duplex is non-conforming as to density, parking, and use. The development proposal is considered an expansion of a non-conforming use because the proposal would add bedrooms and also floor area. And just generally, the non-conforming use review criteria are focused on minimizing adverse impacts to the surrounding properties, maintaining consistency with surrounding uses, as well as the area character, and improving the appearance of the property and decreasing the level of nonconformity on the site. The review process provides flexibility for improving, rehabilitating, or expanding nonconforming properties, and just generally can promote reinvestment in neglected structures or properties. So as part of the public process, written notice was sent, and notice was also posted on the property. Some public comment was received, which has been forwarded to the board. Generally, the concerns are a change in character in the neighborhood, site conditions and management, and just other nuisances. And a member of the public called up the application for a hearing on June 1st. In terms of context, it's approximately a 1/4 acre property located on the corner of Cascade Avenue and 16th Street in the University Hill neighborhood. It's roughly a quarter mile from the campus, the University of Colorado campus, with easy access to an underpass at Euclid. The site is located in the residential low 1 zone district, which is defined as single-family detached residential dwelling units at low to very low residential densities. The properties to the west are also zoned RL1. However, the alley demarcates the boundary to residential medium 2 zoning, and attached dwellings like a duplex would be allowed in that zoning. And just to give some context, the allowable density per the underlying land use designation is shown on the screen just for your reference. Just to give a little bit more context, a majority of the properties to the west are single-family homes, but there are a number of non-conforming duplexes. But a large proportion of the properties to the east are developed as multifamily residential housing, primarily duplexes, and many of those do serve as student rental housing due to the proximity to the university. The existing structure was built in 1939, and as I said, it is non-conforming as to density because it does not meet the minimum lot area per dwelling unit and also exceeds the maximum number of dwelling units per acre. Also parking, because they have 2 conforming off-street parking spaces where 3 are required, and use just generally because attached dwellings are not allowed in the RL1 zone district. It's unclear from city records how the duplex was established and the approved number of bedrooms. However, it is clear that the attic was considered uninhabitable space and also that the addition above the garage was not intended to be used as a bedroom. So the proposal would be to officially convert a previously approved recreational room into a bedroom, which would include the addition of a closet and a bathroom. Also convert the attic space to a bedroom with egress window and also a code-compliant stairway. And then lastly, convert a portion of the garage to storage and office space. The resulting duplex would have 2 3-bedroom units. And as part of the proposal, several site improvements are proposed to meet the review criteria. The first would be updating the landscape to exceed the code requirements. The proposal includes the addition of 4 new trees and 102 new scrubs. The intent of the landscape plan is to enhance the single-family appearance of the property, and the proposal also includes a new automatic irrigation system. Next, they would provide 4 spaces of short-term bike parking and 4 spaces of long-term bike parking within the garage, and this amount would exceed the requirement of 4 spaces. They would also remove the non-conforming parking spaces, which are located in the landscape setback and the right-of-way, and provide established head-in paved parking spaces off of the alley that meet code requirements. 1 space would still be provided in the attached garage, and they would also have a space in the driveway, which would be a total of 4 spaces. And lastly, the proposal includes a new trash enclosure on a concrete slab with screening. So the one key issue identified by staff was whether generally the proposal meets the criteria for the expansion of a non-conforming use. As described in the memo, staff finds that generally it is consistent. In terms of character and compatibility, like I said, the majority of the properties to the east are primarily duplexes. There's also a number of non-conforming duplexes to the west. Thus, the proposed addition of bedrooms would be compatible with the area. The proposal would have minimal negative impact because the allowable occupancy of the property would not increase. The vehicular parking would not increase with this proposal, and the proposal would have minimal effects on parking generation. And this is just showing a fairly recent study done by CU, or survey, I should say, where 75% of students walk, bike, or ride to campus. Also, the elimination of the parking within the setback and right-of-way and the addition of landscaping on the street-facing portions of the property would reduce adverse visual impacts. They're also just generally increasing the number of parking spaces from 2 to 4 and providing a defined parking area would help to alleviate the effects of the duplex and also the long-term and short-term bike parking. And just in terms of the physical appearance of the site, the proposal would just generally promote reinvestment in the property and reduce visual impacts by providing a new trash enclosure and excess landscaping and also a defined parking area. So staff finds the proposal is substantially consistent with the criteria and recommends Planning Board approve the application subject to the recommended conditions of approval. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Terrific. Thank you, Sloan. And just to let folks in the public know, we'll now have an opportunity for the board to ask just questions of staff. That will be followed by a presentation by the applicant if he or she would like to make one, followed by some more questions, then an opportunity for the public to address us, and then we'll come back for our decision-making. Before we get there, I do want to go down and make sure nobody has any disclosures that they need to make. Anybody?
Just site visits, couple drive-bys.
Yeah, I was by it every day last week, coming back from Pottery Lab where my son was in camp, so I saw it a lot. Site visits.
And I've done site visits as well.
One site visit on June 1st timeframe.
Great. So with that, any questions from the board? Okay.
Well, actually,
Go ahead.
there's a number of different landscaping and improvements. Are those pretty much conditions of approval and we don't have to worry about? Because I just want to make sure that they're all pretty much agreed to.
Yeah, so in this case, they did use a professional landscape professional to prepare the plans, and they would be held to that if it were approved.
Okay, thank you.
Make a motion?
Sure. Actually, no.
Oh.
Because we still need to hear from the applicant and we need to hear from the public. So, is there an applicant?
Move on.
And I appreciate the spirit. So, is there an applicant who'd like to make a presentation? Please, go ahead. Come join us, and if you could let us know your name and address.
Yes, sir. I'm Lawrence Varner, and I'm the owner of 802 16th Street. I currently live at 3040 Pennsylvania. I want to thank you for the opportunity to present tonight. This, I'd like to back it up if I could. Okay, thank you. This is a very attractive 3,600 square foot legal non-conforming duplex, and it sits on the northeast corner of 16th and Cascade and appears like a typical neighborhood family home. I purchased my home in June of 2012. It's 78 years old with 4 current bedrooms and a 441 square foot rec room, as well as a 500 square foot attic space. The maximum occupancy is 6 unrelated adults. My family and I lived on the main level, and then I rented the second unit to college students for the past 5 years. I know we know the Hill, but just to be complete, that it's the primary off-campus housing option for students, and that's been that way since the 20s. The total Hill population is now around 28,000. With 57% of Hill residents enrolled at CU. This property at 16th and Cascade Crossroads is uniquely sandwiched between a whole neighborhood of RM2 medium density and RH5 higher density, which are apartments, student rentals to the east of my back alley. And the Cascade Street is a major corridor for thousands of students living east in duplexes and apartment buildings. The red arrows show the usual walking pattern when kids come home at night after fraternity parties and bars close up, and the concentration gets larger and larger as they get closer to my corner and disperse into the duplexes, which are all the yellow with the Ds on them. Those are all duplexes. The picture of this is taken from my bedroom window, and I did use the large rec room as my bedroom, not knowing I wasn't allowed. Those are students sitting on the roof of a duplex right behind me, and that duplex sits on 17th Street, which is a very high police call area. They're just outrageously loud over there. And this is the alley between the duplex group and my home, and you can see there's trash in the alley there. And this picture is taken from my bedroom looking north. That's a rental property right to the north. It's a beautiful large home. And there's also a rental property, an ADU rental to the direct south of me. So on 3 sides, I have rental property. This is a police call log that I actually conjured up from the police department in Boulder. I finally called them and said, do you have this available? This covers 2.5 years and shows that I made 38 calls between, I believe it was January 14 and July 17 to the police because of the loud noise and loud parties on weekends from the 17th Street duplex groups. And they're right, like I say, in my backyard. There's the second page. So my duplex acts as a buffer on this busy corner and has no control over the hundreds of rowdy student passersby. There's no rental creep here. The higher density duplex student rentals just east of my alley have been well established. Per city approval, there have been and will be 6 responsible occupants living within my property. My own tenants have had no noise complaints since I began renting to students 5 years ago. We screen and use a strong lease and live nearby to manage efficiently. I have 4 current goals for my legal duplex. I'd like to present a beautifully landscaped and welcoming flagship duplex property to house 6 respectful college students. I'd like to provide each of my 6 tenants with their own private bedroom. To reduce nonconformity in my property while achieving these goals and dramatically improve the appearance of the property, I'd like to improve the community too and make the neighborhood more attractive. My master bedroom, 48 years ago, a prior owner permitted and built this 21-foot by 21-foot recreation room on the main floor. And it's the largest, it's up on the upper right corner over the garage. And it has hardwood floors, vaulted ceiling, plenty of windows, and ambient light with vines covering a lot of the windows. This was used by several owners, including myself, as a master bedroom. Last April, 15 months ago, I began an interior remodel to add a bathroom inside this room. I also began to improve and upgrade the 500 square foot attic space, replacing the original 1939 knob and tube wiring. This is the original sales brochure I received in 2012, and I'll close up on that yellow highlight. They were mentioning the attic with 500 square feet. I presumed there was an attic with 500 square feet. The dormer on the top is the dormer, one of the 2 that feed into this upstairs bedroom. This one faces west. And this is a stained glass window that I had commissioned by Boulder Stained Glass for historical restoration purposes. I had this installed last year in that front 16th Street dormer. Facts that I'd like to present are that this interior remodel project does not increase the current occupancy limit of 6. And as there have been 6 adults living there during my occupancy, this interior remodel does not increase the neighborhood impact. To improve exterior appearance and reduce nonconformity, I propose the following. I'd like to remove 2 of the nonconforming parking spaces and double the number of conforming spaces from 2 to 4. I'd like to reduce nonconformity by observing lot corner visual requirements through landscaping of the site triangle at Cascade in the back alley, and I'll show you that in a minute. I'd like to install new landscape and sprinkler drip systems designed by a qualified landscape architect. This includes 102 new shrubs, 8 new trees, Cascade Street hedge, and I did get a permit for the sprinkler system. They started on the sprinklers this week. I'd like to add both short and long-term bike parking. I'd like to change the address of 802 and a half 16 to 804 per the Boulder Building Department's recommendation. We did install the period stained glass, and I'd like to do the addition of a trash, recycle, and compost enclosure with a pad of concrete. This is our current trash setup, so I think that would be very amenable, quite an improvement. This is the landscape architect's plans, and they're very detailed, showing where to put the trees, and I can't point them out, but on the south side, there are 4 maple trees, and there are also 4 evergreens, and then the parking has been moved north along the alley, and just south of that parking area, you can see the short-term bike parking, and then on the alley would be the trash enclosure. In between that boxed-in area is protection for a giant tree that's sitting there now. The front yard, we would take out the Fitzers and rearrange the, that's on the left-hand side, and rearrange the garden area and put rose bushes. Cascade Street hedge involves 22 of these clavy dwarf honeysuckle bushes, if you know what they are. Parallel along those toward the sidewalk are 61 bright edge yucca, and it's truly beautiful. I tried to download a picture of it, but it didn't come out today. I've had my share of vandalism. This is my Lexus car door. It was kicked in one Friday night as I lived there, and the next morning I drove down Cascade and found several other cars with the same damage. We get sprinkler heads kicked off, at least 2 a week, and that's been a real headache. While I can't control actions of the passerby, I can control the beautification of my property and therefore improve our neighborhood. This non-conforming use review is a criteria-based decision. So the summary of the criteria for the non-conforming use review are as follows. We have sound rationale. This legal non-conforming duplex continues to provide a compatible transition between higher intensity and lower intensity uses. We have reasonable compatibility with and have minimal negative impact on the use of nearby properties, including next-door rentals to the north, south, and east. We have undertaken all reasonable measures to reduce or alleviate the effects of nonconformity upon the surrounding area. The physical appearance of the property and the new landscaping will improve, and the degree of nonconformity will clearly decrease. I want to thank the board for your attention.
Thank you very much. Does the board have any questions?
I
ahead, Crystal.
actually have a question. So we had received a number of emails, I don't know if Planning Department provided them to you from the neighbors?
Yes.
Talking about the condition of the yard and the landscaping. So were you living there when the yard started deteriorating?
Yes.
or-
Yes, it was. We ran into a lot of problems with the sprinkler heads being destroyed. The obsolete current landscape system was very frustrating, and we also ran into a problem with Boulder replacing sidewalk, and they did that last summer, and as you can see, the new sidewalk, they ripped up, accidentally, of course, one of our main sprinkler lines, and that's it sticking out of the ground. I was under a stop work order. I didn't know which way to go with regard to the landscape, and then I eventually learned that I could improve the property in this regard and have a negotiation point to try to get the house developed as I'd liked interiorly. So the question then was, how do I find a landscape architect, which was difficult, and even more difficult was to find a landscape company that was available for within the next 6 to 8 months, because everybody was tied up. So I finally found one that I said, well, this meeting's coming up. What I'd like to do is at least get the grass and trees back. And if things go through, then we've got to set up the current system to accommodate all the new landscaping, which you saw, the 102 plants and 8 trees and all that stuff. And it was quite a challenge, but they worked it out, and they're installing now. But it's been a long ordeal.
Thank you.
Other questions for Mr. Varner? Terrific, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Now's the time when we'll hear from the public. Thank you, Cindy. And we've got 3 folks who are signed up right now. If others would like to speak, see Cindy and she can get you signed up. I'll call you your name, come up, let us know your name and where you live, and then you'll have 3 minutes to address the board. And with that, we'll start with David Apple. Welcome.
Good evening. My name is David Apple. I live directly west across the street at 805 16th Street, and I have a few concerns regarding this property and what the owner is wanting to do with the property. We've lived there for almost 2.5 years. We moved into the diversity of the hill. We embrace the diversity. We like the students. We like the single-family dwellings, and we invested a large amount of money in this home, and we want to stay there the rest of our life. What we don't appreciate is when someone tries to skirt the rules of the law by doing modifications to the inside of their home illegally without a permit until they're caught, and then they have to get the proper permits like we all do if we want to improve our home. What we don't really appreciate is the condition of the home right now and what it has been in the past. There's been no improvements made since we lived there other than until the past week or so that we've noticed. The fence is broken. The yard is in disarray. We had a large party 4th of July where the so-called good students were there. It was loud, fireworks all night, went on all through the night. We don't like to call the police a lot. We have called the police a few times in the past couple of years since we lived there. We like to be friendly neighbors. We like to give all the students the accommodations they need to have fun, but we live right across the street. And what I feel like is coming here is going to be more of the same. I don't know how we're going to go ahead and enforce the rules of the variances. If we approve the variances, are they going to be maintained? Is he going to be a good homeowner and make sure that things are in good working order? I'm kind of have mixed feelings about this. If we don't approve the variances, does that mean it stays as it is, as another rental, another duplex that's going to be in disarray? I like to improve the neighborhood. I like to improve the hill in itself. We invested in the hill. We want to stay on the hill. We just feel like that there's been some misgivings on how this was approached and how this was all taking place until the neighbors got together and decided that we need to invest in the hill and make sure that we want the hill to be there and to be a good place to live forever. I just don't know what recourses we have for this. If this is going to be improved, how can the variances make sure that we keep this up to snuff and make sure that that all the rules are going to be followed? Thank you.
Terrific, thank you, Mr. Apple. Next up, I believe, is Erica Meyer. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. My name's Erica Meyer. I live at 1590 Cascade on the corner of 16th and Cascade, directly diagonal from this home. And I understand that if the variance is granted, there's a requirement to beautify the neighborhood. However, if you reviewed the letter from the homeowner that was submitted to the city council, that sounded like a person who has given up on the neighborhood, who has kind of thrown his hands up and said, I don't want to live here anymore. Not a person who is invested in beautifying the neighborhood. I mean, when I read that, I submit that letter as evidence to, why I hesitate to, grant this variance. I wonder, you can put some shrubs in, but if the sprinkler heads get kicked over next week and you didn't maintain it last year and you can't find a person to do landscaping, how are those sprinkler heads going to be fixed in 2 weeks when they get kicked over? Those shrubs are going to die, and then we've granted this variance. Can this variance be revoked if this property is not maintained? Or once it's granted, is it granted and that's it? Everything can be allowed to be not maintained. Since it hasn't been maintained up to this point, I don't really understand why it would be maintained in the future. I don't have a variance on my house, and I do maintain it. So also, I wonder if the home is sold, does the new owner then need to comply with the maintenance of the landscaping? And what would happen if the home is sold? Do I have any recourse as a neighbor to say, we don't want 6 people living in this home anymore? This is in a R1 zone, so I think, we have those zones for a reason. This is an R1 zone, not an R2 zone. And if we keep saying, well, you granted it to this person and this person, so now grant it to me in this zone, it's just spreading more and more of these problems that have been brought up multiple times, but even by the owner himself. I don't want more of those problems in the neighborhood. I would prefer fewer. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, Ms. Meyer. And then finally, I think the last person signed up is Stacy Silverstein. And again, if anybody else would like to sign up, now's a good time to do so. Welcome.
Stacy Silverstein, I live at 805 16th Street, and I guess I would just start by asking all of you a question. If you want to see homeowners stay in the Hill, if you want to see that as a mixed-use neighborhood, where we live, yes, it's a block away from higher density, but it's not higher density. It's zoned as an R1. And the owner can talk about how, well, there's no scope creep there, but that is scope creep if you grant a variance on that. I'd also say that we have a sprinkler system in our house. We live across the street. We've never had our sprinkler heads kicked. And if we had a sprinkler head that was damaged, we would replace it immediately. We don't have trash strewn on our lawn. We don't have a dilapidated fence. We don't have a rundown home. And that's what that home looked like for the last 2.5 years since we've lived there. So I can't imagine how the home is going to be better when the homeowner's attitude in that letter was, if you can't beat them, join them. I'm sick of the noise, so I'm just going to rent it out to students and let the rest of the neighbors be damned. That's exactly what the message this is sending. And I am just devastated by the fact that it's not another homeowner moving in there and caring and loving for their home the way that we do and the way that the neighbors around us do. So I just, I'm concerned if a variance would make it better, that would be incredible. But it's hard for me to imagine, based upon the past performance of the owner, that that will really be maintained. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Silverstein. Would anyone else like to address the board on this issue this evening? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing and actually maybe start with a question to Sloan, Charles, or Hella. I think there were a few questions that the public had raised, including what the recourse would be if, for example, the sprinkler system is not maintained, if the landscape is not watered, what happens if it's sold? What would occur if the board were to grant the requested action tonight?
Well, first of all, I would say that if it were approved, they would be required to sign a development agreement, which would transfer to a title commitment if they ever sold the property. So in theory, any future owner would know that there's an approval on their property that they're held to. I would also just say the benefit of an approval like this is we'll actually have approved plans that are very specific that we can actually enforce upon. So if someone ever made a complaint that they weren't in compliance, then we would be able to send out enforcement staff to let the property owner know that, and there is a recourse for that.
That's up to and including having to go back to the planning board, up to and including having their approval revoked. So then in essence, it would just have to revert back to a by right single-family detached home. So there's enforceability that exists well beyond just this owner. It runs with the property.
And then if someone were to make a complaint, who do they complain to?
The city's code enforcement division, zoning enforcement.
Great. Other questions, comments, discussion?
So,
Crystal?
Charles, a couple of questions that I have. One, when you were, what type of zoning code could get a property, could get an approval revoked and have it go back to a single-family house? Is it over occupancy? Is it letting the trees and shrubs die?
It's any violation of the approval, so it could be dead landscaping, it could be over occupancy, really anything that is outside of the confines of the approval that the board would be issuing.
So how long does landscaping have to be kept alive for any of our approvals, for a use review or a site review?
Forever.
Forever, okay. I called in one on College and 11th. Do you remember the youth hostel that was approved? I think Brian was on the board. So one tree died, and one tree was broken off. The tree that was broken off has now sprouted out, which is an unhealthy situation. But, I don't think something like that would cause that project to revert back to a youth
Right, that would be the worst-case scenario,
Yeah.
most extreme enforcement measure. Typically, our code enforcement philosophy is to work toward an expedient and successful resolution. Compliance is really what we're after.
So then that would be up to the neighbors, or does the city have a program where you go around and check different use reviews and site reviews to make sure that the landscaping, et cetera,
Sure.
is living?
So we practice complaint-based enforcement. We don't have patrols that are out proactively looking for violations, although not to say that when our officers aren't out on their regular rounds, if they notice things, they won't, that they'll inquire about them. But yeah, for the most part, it really is complaint-based enforcement.
I would just add too, as part of the building permit, we would have someone go out and inspect the landscaping to make sure that it was properly installed.
Well, yeah, I would imagine. Thank you for clarifying that. So, but over occupancy could be something that would trigger a revocation.
Absolutely.
So discussion, motions? David? Yeah, sure.
Need to turn on my microphone. I know that all three of the speakers we heard from, the neighbors, mentioned granting a variance, but I just want to clarify, we're not really granting a variance here. We're allowing an additional a use without revoking the non-conforming status of the property. Would that be more accurate? We're not really, or are we?
No, we're not approving any variances. You're absolutely right. This evening's proceedings is for the board to consider, in effect, the expansion of a non-conforming use. So the code has some very specific mechanisms that allow these sorts of things to occur. So that's the action that the board would be conducting this evening. So not a variance.
And I'm not saying that, there were still valid points. I just want to make sure that we.
Yeah, for the record. I appreciate that. Thank you.
So just let me understand your recommendation a little bit more. So the expansion of the nonconforming use that's being applied for, you feel that it's been mitigated by this landscaping, parking, reorganization, et cetera?
Right, so the non-conforming use review criteria basically says either you're reducing the degree of nonconformity or you're improving the appearance of the site or building. So in this case, they're meeting the second part of that criteria by improving the appearance. And I think I said in the presentation, the whole intent of those criteria were to allow these types of properties to improve over time and to promote reinvestment in these properties.
Peter, you raised.
I was trying to follow the reasoning and logic of showing all of the horrible things happening around the property and then hearing the neighbors talk about how it's been in that shape since the day that the owners moved in. It almost seems like they were working to create a situation that was so foul that they can now say they are going to make it better if they're granted this. And it seems a little bit like the system is being gamed in order to get, more rent out of the property. And that concerns me a bit. The neighbors' comments.
Crystal? I know I I agree with what you're saying, but I think the testimony from the owner was, and some of the neighbors in our letters, has been when the owner moved out, then the property started going downhill.
Okay.
I'd like to just clarify.
Actually, the public comment's closed, so sorry about that.
Then-
Other,
So then now it's that when the improvements are
I
made.
could be wrong, though. Apparently, I
Peter
could be
finish.
wrong.
So, so when the improvements are made, then a net benefit will be granted to the nonconforming use, additional nonconforming use that we'd be granting would allow what? They would allow them to do what? I guess I'm trying to understand that where they are now and where they're going next.
So currently, the attic on the main floor unit is not habitable space. It's not a bedroom. So they would add an egress, they'd add egress and
Okay.
meet life safety standards to make it a legitimate bedroom. And then the rec room that they have been using as a bedroom, our records show that that was never intended to be a bedroom, so that it would just be legitimizing that. And then there's a small part of the garage that they would be converting from parking into office and storage, and also long-term bike parking.
So it's taking it's basically freeing up, what's a bedroom go for on the hill? 800, 600, 1,000? Just freeing up that additional rent.
But,
David?
But without adding any additional allowable dwellers. So there's always been 6 dwellers maximum in this property, and they would not be able to increase the number. So yes, there probably would be rent increase, but I wouldn't, but there wouldn't
Be more people.
be more allowed people.
Okay, that helps me.
further comment or discussion? I'll just add maybe, and then see if someone has a motion that, I do share your concern. Peter, I think based on the facts and circumstances, do have a concern that there's some gaming that's been going on here. And I also do share some of the concerns about, increasing the nature of that in this neighborhood and pushing it. That being said, we have criteria in the code, and unfortunately, I think we're kind of stuck with those criteria. So I think it's, my perspective, it meets those criteria, but it does beg questions about whether we need to look at changing those criteria.
I would,
Peter, then David.
not increasing, it's going to provide a better living experience for the 6 people that will be there anyway. And if it holds the owner's feet to the fire over maintenance of the site, which that money should be available now, assuming that there will be additional rent coming in, because an individual bedroom will get more rent. Therefore, the owner's going to have more money to take care of the property. And there won't be any more people than there are now. They'll just be hopefully higher paying tenants, which is hopefully going to provide for a better environment for the neighbors. So I hear you.
Yeah, and I'll just speak because I'd really like, the neighbors to understand what our responsibility is here. I actually live close enough to campus. I live down Aurora, kind of on the other side of campus from you all. And I've had numerous, how should I say, conflicts with my neighbors over the years. And, it is really stressful. I know that. But in this forum and for what we're looking at, it's not really a place where our job is to resolve specific conflicts. It's just to look to see if this particular use is going to negatively impact. And from what I've seen, since there's no expansion of the property, no additional people living there, and all these improvements, physical improvements, are being promised, I can't see how this particular use on the inside of the home will negatively impact the neighbors. So the other side would just be a punitive thing, which, doesn't really make sense to me, to use this process for punitive purposes. And I do think that there will be net benefits from having the parking become further off the alleyway, from having the landscaping improved. So I do want to make sure that we know that. And it's not our job. We can't turn it back into a single family or turn it into a single family home. That's not the question in front of us. When you have a non-conforming property, it's being allowed for a reason, because it's been that way for a long time, and that would be a whole different process to take away the overall non-conforming.
Crystal?
Well, thank you, David. I am not going to vote for this because I do not find it meets the site review criteria 9-2-15. It's an RL1 neighborhood. This, by adding the additional bedrooms, it makes it more non-conforming in that RL1 neighborhood. It doesn't matter that the zoning across the alley is another zone. It's facing, in addition, it's facing a whole block of, another block of RL1. So I understand that doing some landscaping is desired, and any property owner should be maintaining their landscaping, quite frankly. But I think the size and operational characteristics by adding 2 more bedrooms, not just 1, but 2 bedrooms, is going to increase that nonconformity.
Is there further discussion or a motion?
A question, actually. So, Charles, I just wanted to ask Hella a question about the statement that you made about having the property go back to a single-family use. So under what authority does the code allow us to strip a legally non-conforming second unit that's been determined to be non-conforming by virtue of it having been subdivided prior to the code?
I think that would only really be if the house was taken down.
Right. Okay, so I just want to make sure that people understand that violation of the terms of an approval tonight would not result in the property going back to single-family use, because that second dwelling unit is a vested right.
No, you're absolutely right. I misspoke.
Okay. So what we're not talking about, an opportunity to see a property go back to single-family. We're just talking about whether
2 less bedrooms.
To, have a property that has 2 fewer bedrooms than it currently does, but provides additional landscaping, parking, and other features as a sort of a quid pro quo under our non-conforming use review standards that we have. And I think that the city of Boulder is very forward-thinking in allowing for nonconformities to be expanded in return for other neighborhood benefits, because there are a lot of communities, the majority of communities around the country, that do not allow a nonconforming use to be expanded at all for any reason. And that can leave neighborhoods stuck with lots of old non-conforming houses that aren't being maintained or improved. And I think this is an opportunity to see this house get improved, and it doesn't increase the density or intensity of the use on the site. So I am going to support the project, and I apologize to any folks who thought I was cutting things off by calling for a motion prematurely, because I do appreciate the input that we got both from the applicant and the community. There's a provision in our code that allows for conditions of approval to be applied to a non-conforming use review approval to improve site design, and also to condition anything that's included in the non-conforming use sections of the code and site review. And so if there are any board members who are interested in, a maintenance condition for the landscaping or anything like that, I would point that out, and maybe Hella can talk about whether we do condition for maintenance, or if it would simply be a site requirement at the time of approval. But I think we could have a conversation like that.
Exactly. I think we actually.
Any further discussion, or would people like to make a motion? Crystal?
I'm not going to make the motion, but I do want to say this board did hear another expansion of a non-conforming use up on the hill, and we did turn it down. It was a situation similar in the sense that some things have been done inside but the landscaping had been run down, so it's used as a justification. We'll clean up the landscaping, it'll make neighbors happy, and, you know, in exchange, we'd like to do this and that. And we really need to change the culture up in the hill where the landlords are starting to be responsible enough that they take care of their property. And I understand the challenges when you live in a high-traffic area. I mean, I live downtown and have picked up cigarette butts and beer cans, maybe nothing as extreme as the hill, but certainly, you know, stuff all over the place. And changing the culture, which is what happened as people started bringing it to the attention of downtown, and they helped inform their employees, you know, don't smoke and throw the cigarette butts out, et cetera. But that's, I think, another discussion, but it's something that we shouldn't have in the code, let your property run down and then come back and ask for more nonconformity, and as a leverage to get people to fix up their landscaping in the property.
David, you
Well, I'd like to make a motion if you're ready. You ready?
prerogative, go for it.
Motion to approve use review application LUR 2017-00003, adopted the staff memorandum as a finding of fact, including the attached analysis of review criteria and subject to the recommended conditions of approval.
Is there a second for that motion? Harmon? Okay, it's been moved by David, seconded by Harmon to approve. Are there other questions?
The maintenance
discussion?
condition, were you saying that we were able to apply a maintenance condition?
Well, I invited a conversation about that, and there's time for a friendly amendment if you're interested.
I do so.
What's-
I do so, and
what's-
I borrow all of your wisdom around what's possible here for the sake of the neighborhood, because the other side of the street is a totally different, it is still a different use. I understand that the behind the house is all duplexes, but the other side of the street is not.
But I think, you know, we can talk to staff about this. I think we'd definitely be on strong, thick ice to require a maintenance plan as part of the conditions of approval. I don't know if we can condition maintenance, but I think if we conditioned a maintenance plan and they were to submit it, then they would be holding themselves to that.
By adopting the proposed landscape plan, you're implicitly adopting a maintenance plan. It has to forever exist in conformity with the adopted landscape plan.
That's enough for me. I don't know if that's enough
Fine.
for you, Peter.
It's fine.
Can I ask, and this may go to Hella as a question, would it be possible as a condition of approval to require a bond or an escrow or some other sort of instrument to ensure there are resources to ensure the maintenance of the landscaping, especially given the lack of compliance over the last few years?
Yeah, I think that's probably possible. One of the questions I would have would be, for how long do you want to hold that bond to ensure compliance? One example that I can think of right now where we frequently require financial guarantee would be eco-passes, for example, and I think there we hold it for 3 years.
Although I think
Well,
we've
actually, for
done
how long
some
do we hold
projects
it?
even longer.
For how long do we hold it? Do you guys know it? I think we ask for a guarantee for the cost of 3 years.
That's correct.
So I'm assuming we're holding it for 3 years.
So I'd like to suggest a friendly amendment as a condition of approval to require a bond, escrow, or other security deemed sufficient by staff in the amount of the value of the landscape improvements that we would hold for 5 years.
Is it 5 years?
Is that acceptable? Is it friendly?
I don't know that it matters.
You know, John, I'm thinking that the whole amount of the landscaping, you know, it's clean because it would allow the entire landscaping operation to be replaced. But, chances are, if we're talking about a bond that's meant to promote maintenance, the physical accoutrements of the landscaping are in, and maybe a smaller bond, such as a quarter or a half or something, would be more reasonable. I can imagine it's a pretty high-priced item, the total value of the landscaping.
We have the authority.
I kind of think that going to a half or a third makes sense, but I would also add irrigation into that. So not just landscaping, but landscaping and irrigation.
And I'd be happy to amend my friendly to cover half of landscaping and irrigation,
Especially since we were, sorry, go ahead.
but interested in staff's
Yeah.
view on that before we move too far.
And can you explain that again? It sounds like you've talked about how to determine the amount to be held, but I missed part of that.
Sure, so I think we determined the amount. I think Harmon had raised the point that it's unlikely that you would need to do a complete replacement of the landscape and irrigation. But it is conceivable, I think, that you would have a portion of that. And so 50% seems like a reasonable measure. It would, I think, be possible to get to 100% replacement, especially with inflation, especially with the need to basically rip things out and start over again if you let it go. But I think 50% is probably a reasonable accommodation and backed off from that 100%.
Hopefully it gets caught before it gets to 100%.
Right. Hopefully it never needs to be called on.
I guess I'm just wondering if there is a 100% amount that we know right now from this proposal, or that would have to be determined.
I think the applicants probably submitted building permit plans, or will be, that would have a dollar value associated.
That would be on the
landscaping and irrigation.
Yeah, I think we would ask our landscape architect to prepare an estimate, and then we'd have our landscape architects verify it.
As long as it's something that's,
doable.
that is done from time to time and not some totally new process.
And so the proposed friendly amendment, which we'll still need to figure out whether to accept, and we'll let staff weigh in before the two makers have a chance, but the idea would be to let staff make that determination rather than us try to figure out a number up here. So.
While they're figuring that out, it might be helpful for us after this item to maybe discuss having a tour of some of these use reviews up on the hill and seeing what people have done, has it been maintained, et cetera. Is it less compatible with the neighborhood as it was before, or has it been made more compatible?
Why don't we take a 2-minute recess, just to give staff a chance to do that, and we won't worry about our quorum. We'll be back in session in 2 minutes. All right. I'd like to call the meeting of the planning board back to order. And before we get started with staff's feedback, I just want to confirm nobody was talking about the matter of the subject back there. I heard only discussion about music, but
You missed the discussion about national politics, but we weren't talking about the matter at hand.
We talked about Red Rocks and shows, yes.
okay, just to confirm. So, Hella or staff?
So I think we've determined that staff actually sometimes already does impose financial guarantees to ensure proper implementation of landscaping plans. And it's typically done for a period of 2 or 3 years, and it's sometimes extended if the landscaping has not been properly established. But we also worked on some language if you wanted to impose that as a condition of approval.
I'd be interested in hearing your language and probably offer that as a proposed friendly amendment.
All right, so I drafted, prior to issuance of a building permit, the applicant shall provide a financial guarantee in an amount of not less than 50% of the costs of implementing the approved landscaping plan to ensure proper installation, establishing, and maintenance of the required landscaping and irrigation for a period of 3 years, which time may be extended if the landscaping plan has not been properly implemented.
It's good.
I think that is good. So I'd like to offer that as a friendly. The two makers of the original motion would take that. David and Harmon.
Oh, yes. I thought it needed a second, I'm sorry.
Friendly.
Okay, great. Any other discussion on the main motion with that? Hearing none, I'll call the question. All in favor of the motion to approve as amended, made by David, seconded by Harmon. All in favor, please say yes and raise your hand. Yes. All opposed? That passes 5-1 with Member Gray opposing. Thank you, Sloan. Thank you, staff. That will bring us to public hearing item 5B, public hearing and consideration of a request for improvements to the Fraser Meadows Congregate Care Facility located at 350 Ponca Place and 4950 Thunderbird Drive within the RH5 zone district. Proposal includes renovations to existing buildings, expansion of existing wellness center and arts and education facilities, and a new 5-story, 55-foot building with 98 independent living units. LUR 2016-00071. Also want to note and appreciate that we have the next generation here in the audience, and I would love to see that here at a planning board hearing. So thanks for joining us tonight. And before we turn to staff, just for public who is new or who are new to us, just to let you know what's going to happen here. The staff is going to make a short presentation about that case. We will then have an opportunity as the board to ask factual questions about that. Then the applicant will have a chance to make a short presentation. We'll have a chance to ask the applicant questions, and then it will be your turn if you'd like to take it to address the board on the issue in front of us. If we do have questions, we will raise those, although they tend to be more sparing, but we have that ability. Then it will return back to the board, and we'll make a decision based on the matter, the application that's in front of us. Before we go to staff, though, I want to just double check to see if anybody has any disclosures that they need to make about ex parte contacts, site visits, or anything else. Maybe start with Crystal and work our way down.
I've been by the site several times. I have friends and acquaintances that live there. And my mother was on a board until recently of a similar type of facility like this and headed up a number of capital campaigns. And by the way, she's 98. I think the last one she worked on was at 90. So I know quite a bit about this, or at least these type of facilities.
Great. Harmon?
I'm in the neighborhood almost every day of the week, and I see the property.
Brian?
Been on site visits, seen the project here, and then also was on the design advisory board when it came in front of that group.
Great. And I've done site visits, bike, and drive by regularly.
Same thing here. I live very close to there, and I also went by today just to kind of check out where all the new things will be laid out.
Great. Peter?
Prior to being appointed to the board, I had met one of the board members and had been introduced to the applicant, but have not met in person.
Great. Thank you. Charles and Elaine, thank you.
Elaine McLaughlin will present the staff analysis.
Thanks, Charles. Good evening, everyone. Just a quick overview of the presentation. So you know where we're headed. We're going to go over some of the background of where this project's been in the process. We'll look at the context, a little bit on the proposed project, and then a couple key issues were identified for discussion this evening that are also in your memo. Shown in the aerial photo, the Fraser Meadows community, it's a 15-acre property with a number of buildings that include independent living units, assisted living units, and memory care units. The community opened in 1960, founded by the Rocky Mountain Conference of the United Methodist Church. And today, among the variety of services and amenities for residents are restaurants, fitness, salon and spa, an art room, library, and community gardens. So the purpose of the hearing today is to allow improvements to the Fraser community, some of which were prompted in response to the floods of 2013. And just to take us back, as we all recall, much of Boulder, Longmont, and other northern Colorado cities were impacted by the severe flooding in 2013, September 2013. That flood also caused significant impacts to most of the eastern half of Fraser Meadows campus, with flood depths averaging about 3 feet. And it flooded out the below-grade parking structure, as you can see here. The single-story assisted living building on the northeast corner that was constructed in the 1960s was damaged beyond repair. So that's the location of where we're going to be looking at a new building this evening. So the intent really is to reconstruct and renovate the Fraser Meadows campus, essentially to be a more resilient and sustainable building post-2013 flooding. The project planning began soon after the flood with internal Fraser Meadows meetings and their consultants. Then in March 2015, an ordinance was approved by council that included an exemption for Fraser Meadows campus from the restrictions to the height modifications. That was also ratified earlier this year, as you know. And then in April 2016, the planning board reviewed a concept plan, and that was followed by a site review submittal. This went to DAB in February of this year, and then staff attended a resident meeting as recently as March. So in terms of context, it's important to note that the land use is high-density residential, essentially where densities are expected of 14 units or more. Consistent with that, the zoning is high-density residential 5, and this is for a variety of types of attached residential units without limitation, apartment buildings, and other complementary uses. With regard to flood, this illustrates the effective FEMA floodplain. The site's impacted by the high hazard zone on the east and southeast corner of the site, and the 100-year floodplain essentially in the middle, and you can also see that 500-year floodplain on the north. And then, as you know, there's a floodplain development permit that was submitted for site improvements that was approved by staff. It's subject to call-up. And the permit proposes installation of several flood defense measures to give more time to execute the emergency response plan that's required, as well as protect the infrastructure assets. The independent living building and the proposed renovations are intended to meet the floodplain development and wetland or wet flood proofing standards. The Boulder Revised Code requires the first floor of the buildings and additions to be elevated 2 feet above the base flood elevation of the 100-year floodplain. And just as an FYI, the applicant's floodplain engineer, as well as the city's floodplain engineer, are available this evening to answer any questions. So the site, most of you are familiar with, but it does help to look at it in the context of what is located nearby. It's, of course, a half mile south of Baseline and directly west of Foothills Expressway. And of course, in this context, there's the Meadows Shopping Center close by, and that has retailers like Safeway and Rite Aid, along with restaurants and other services. Kaiser Permanente medical offices are just around the corner, as is the Homewood Suites Hotel, and then the Colorado Flatiron Athletic Club is just across the street. Also a branch of the Boulder Public Library. So in the immediate context, the site's bordered on the west by the Arleigh Burke Park, and it creates essentially significant views to the Flatirons from the subject property. The Mountain View Methodist Church is located across the street. Sioux Drive on the south, you can see, creates a transition to single-family residential, and then extending to the east is a bike and pedestrian overpass over Foothills Expressway. And then across Thunderbird Drive from the site to the north are condominiums. And Thunderbird Drive in this context is a local road. However, Foothills Expressway that parallels it is a CDOT highway, 4-lane CDOT highway, as you can see here. For the campus itself, the front door is essentially off of Pawnee Place and Ponca Place. There's some images that illustrate some of the independent living units and some recently constructed units, as well as the healthcare center. And then also you can see it backed up here with some of the units behind. The existing 5-story, 55-foot tall independent living is part of Fraser North that you can see here. So onto this existing site, the applicant's proposing a number of landscape improvements, as well as several additions, including the Arts and Education addition and main entry lobby and office improvements. There's an addition to the wellness facility and then the new independent living building in that northeast corner, along with what's called the Bridge Cafe. And I'll go over each of these little independent pieces briefly. So when we take a look at the front door of Fraser Meadows, the new entry lobby, along with the arts and entertainment addition, essentially consolidates that function that is currently in different parts of the campus to one main part. Among the key elements of the addition are that there's 2 large classroom spaces along with a multi-purpose room that you can see in that lower right that can be divided into smaller rooms. On the second story, there's a 28-seat movie theater along with administrative offices that you can see in the lower right. And then this image illustrates what the proposal would look like with the arts and entertainment function on the right. So the existing wellness building is proposed to have an addition. They are referring to it as a natatorium, which is essentially a pool area. And this is the view that you can see. This is internal to the campus, so this view is seen nowhere except internal to the courtyard space. So also proposed is the 5-story independent living building, and that's in that location of the 1960s building that is no longer habitable. It's planned with 98 units, designed with 5 stories. The ground floor is a parking structure. The second and third stories have a bridge to what's referred to as the Bridge Cafe. It's a new dining venue. And then you can also see there's additional units planned on the 4th and 5th stories. This is an image that you can see from Thunderbird Drive. With regard to the calculation of density for congregate care, there's occupancy equivalencies in the land use code for congregate care that essentially define 5 sleeping rooms or accommodations without kitchens as constituting 1 dwelling unit. There's 3 attached dwelling units, essentially with a kitchen, that constitute a dwelling unit. And then, not relevant to this project, is a 1 detached dwelling unit equivalent to 1 dwelling unit. And just a word about the unit count at Fraser Meadows. On the dais, there's a clarification of the number of units is calculated using those equivalency standards, specifically about the 98-unit proposed independent living building. So rather than it being a 1-to-1, it's not a detached unit. These aren't detached units. They calculate as 3-to-1. So in essence, what you see is a recalculation of dwelling units. For the most part, that doesn't really impact this site because it's a very large site, and density in the RH5 is calculated based on 1,600 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit And given the fact that there's 15 acres, you can see that it's well within that 1 DU per 1,600 square feet. Similarly, with regard to open space, you can see that it's well in excess, of course, of the required open space given the campus that's been developed over time. For parking, the requirement for congregate care is a little unusual in that it's essentially dependent on what's appropriate for the use and needs of the facility and number of vehicles used by occupants as determined through review. So staff had the applicant prepare a parking study, and in this case, it notes the rather unique context for parking here in that it's not just driven by demand from residents, but as you can see, there's daily visitors that come to the site. There's visitors for memorials or other events that come to the site, as well as volunteers. And then the workforce is comprised by a number of different types of folks, including security, dining, healthcare, housekeeping, laundry, mechanical, wellness, and the beauty shop. So there's a number of employees on site that would utilize parking as well. That essentially correlates to a total of 423 spaces that are proposed. This is more than exists today, about 32 spaces more. The parking study concluded, and staff found it to be a solid finding, that it really is intended to accommodate new residential units, but also to reduce walking distance for elderly residents and visitors by having parking close by. And then essentially ensuring that interaction with on-street parking and traffic is reduced, again, in deference to the population. And then finally, to accommodate visitors to the new units, as well as memorials or other events. With regard to key issue number 1 and the consistency of site review criteria, the first criteria essentially asks if the project's consistent with the comp plan, both policies and the land use. And we've discussed how it's essentially high-density residential land use, which of course makes sense. And then with regard to specific policies, of course, 7.03 is relevant given that it's essentially a special needs population. In this case, the comp plan recommends that it be located in proximity to things like other services, medical services, schools, entertainment, public transportation. And as we demonstrated with the perspective on the context, of course, this is a good spot for that use. With regard to another very important policy of the comp plan, 7.09, it looks to planning for additional housing for all stages of life. And of course, we all know that the demographic is changing. There's an aging population both locally and nationally. And so this represents an opportunity to help address the demand for this specialized type of housing within Boulder, for Boulder residents. Then with regard to the site review criteria related to alternatives to the automobile, it's important to note the fairly robust TDM the applicant provided that includes a number of provisions that are in place today, as well as eco-passes for employees, resident bus tickets that are available on in the front lobby for the various 209 buses that you can see, bus stops that are around the site. There's an existing car share program on site and a shuttle service that exists. So in addition to all that, the proposed project will provide a total of 33 short-term and 65 long-term bike spaces. Another site review criterion evaluates design details and human scale of the proposed project in relation to public streets. In this case, it would be Thunderbird and Foothills for the new independent living building in particular. So in that regard, staff notes that the Design Advisory Board overall expressed fairly positive feedback on the proposed design, particularly with regard to materials, the building proportions and composition, and the integration of the new building additions with existing buildings. And also, DAB and staff both acknowledge and observe that this criterion generally would create a design solution with ground floor activity. However, this approach, as both staff and DAB concluded, is appropriate given the context, both with the flood context as well as the population needing to have access to parking nearby and easily accessible. It's essentially creating unoccupiable space with a lobby space and then parking at the ground floor. But beyond that, there's also the use of durable materials such as the native sandstone and the brick. And then in this particular location, a very viable and detailed landscape plan that would help to provide pedestrian interest that would then meet this criterion. So then with regard to key issue number 2, incompatibility of the 55-foot height for the independent living building, the specific criteria that the land use code asks is if the building's height is in general proportion to height of existing buildings in the immediate area. And of course, staff noted in the packet that there are larger buildings, both in the BC2 zone district we talked about, with the nearby Bramford condominiums. It's actually 7 stories, which couldn't happen today, of course, but it does actually help to establish a context of higher intensity, higher density, bigger buildings in this location. Then, of course, there's the buildings that occur on the campus as well, some of which are up to 55 feet. So in that regard, this new building would meet this criterion for that context. So then similarly, the site review criterion asks about orientation of buildings to minimize shadows and blocking of views from adjacent properties. So in that regard, staff looked at possible viewshed impacts toward the mountains and the Flatirons moving along, essentially along Foothills Expressway. And staff notes that a 55-foot tall building along Foothills would, of course, distinctly punctuate that viewshed. However, it's important to note, as you can see in this video clip, that when you're moving at 45 miles per hour, there's the existing 55-foot building. That is essentially an ephemeral changing viewshed. You see things punctuate the viewshed and then it disappears and changes. And there's also things in the foreground, such as landscape and other features that tend to change that viewshed as well. So staff then looked at potential viewshed encroachments from properties across Foothills Expressway, and while the city's definition of adjacent really wouldn't apply to a broad right-of-way like a 175-foot highway or expressway, staff did take a look at potential viewshed encroachments, and as you can see from the exhibit, the distance from the nearest building across Foothills to the location of the planned independent living building is essentially maybe 300 feet. So when you look at essentially our scale that shows the 55-foot tall height, and we move that over to where that location nearest to the nearest building across Foothills, you can see that it's likely there's going to be some encroachment in the viewshed. However, staff finds that that wouldn't really meet the qualification for adjacency or that intent of adjacency impacting viewshed. A little bit closer, just to finish up here. Of course, the closer property is the Flatiron Athletic Club right next door, but as you can see from this image, the views essentially go about 10 degrees to the southwest. And in this particular case, the new building, which you can see by the asterisks of the existing building, is due south. So those impacts really don't exist to this in this particular context as well. So with that, I'll wrap it up. If there's questions of staff, I'm happy to answer them. There's also other staff members available to answer questions as well.
Great. Thank you, Elaine, and thank you for the extra work on some of those view issues, which is helpful. Questions for staff? Brian?
I have one. Since this had a earlier site review submittal, I'm assuming it doesn't have to meet the current City of Boulder energy codes. Is that right?
I believe that's correct. Yeah, it was in before that deadline.
Okay. And the follow-up question is, how would staff feel about trying to impose that on this project? And you don't have to answer it right now. Yeah. You can answer that later.
Okay. We'll defer to Helen on that. Thanks.
Crystal.
So, Elaine, so the transportation demand management plan with eco-passes, do the eco-passes go to residents also? Do you know that?
They can't be given to residents, but what they can give are packets of bus tickets, essentially. But the eco-passes are intended to be for employees.
But is there some RTD law that prohibits them from having eco-passes for?
You know, there was something interesting that just came up. Hella can answer that question with regard to another project, residential project, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Edward.
Edward's ready to go here.
Good evening, Edward Stafford, Public Works Development Services. Eco-passes are, of course, managed by RTD and have to be provided according to their rules. If it's not in a neighborhood eco-pass area, then the residents are not eligible. So you can't just walk in and buy an eco-pass in that same system. So that's why in this one you see it's only for the business part, the employee base.
So in other words, if the residents wanted eco-passes, they'd have to form an eco-pass neighborhood and apply to RTD under those conditions?
Correct, and work through the conditions and rules that RTD has for those formations.
Okay, so my second question is how long, so the eco-pass is for employees, but how long of a time period are they buying them for, or are they committing to as a condition of this site review?
The standard condition is 3 years, and one other point that Charles wanted me to mention was that for residents, there is this existing shuttle service, which is pretty effective, and the applicant can talk about that a little bit more.
Okay, I'll ask the applicant that. The other question I have, unless you have a follow-up on eco-passes or transportation.
Want me to go first because I have something on that. I noticed it mentioned that they will have 10 booklets of 10 tickets each for local, 10 each for regional. If those run out, then people would buy their own for the rest of the year, or do they?
I think that's a great question for the applicant. I'm not sure that we could hold them any more beyond what the TDM has.
But that's our condition, or the condition you're proposing. Okay.
The TDM, yep.
Thank you.
Great.
And
Crystal,
I
you
have
another
a
question?
question on just the flood. So I know you're not allowed to do this, but I'm going to ask this question to you. Will these buildings increase any flows to off-site properties?
Since it's an easy answer, I'll handle it rather than our floodplain engineer. And no, they can't increase the flows off-site in terms of the quantity or flow rate, I should say, and they can't create, of course, any negative or adverse impacts to other surrounding properties.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Another flood-related question. The high hazard area seems to run pretty much the length of the east side of the property. And when I was walking along there, I saw that there's these at least one sunken area with conduits, and I could see how, in a, less than a 100-year flood event, there'd probably be water going through there like crazy. But above that, it didn't seem like that area was all that lower than the rest. So is the high hazard really kind of limited to those really lowered areas, or is it include really that everything along that east side? I was just trying to figure that out.
I'd have to dig deeper into the actual model to see. Keep in mind the high hazard is a defined area where the depth times the velocity is 4 or greater. So it may be that there's a higher velocity also along that stretch.
That would make sense. Thank you.
And just one more question, and I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but the dam that's been discussed on the CU South property, that is going to address the 100-year flood, but it wouldn't address the 500-year, correct?
Don't know that I have an exact answer to that because it really hasn't been modeled yet to look at the new floodplain delineation. It probably would have some impact on both the 100-year and 500-year, whereas the design, of course, to that mitigation is about the 100-year. But just by the fact that you are withholding or detaining that water, I would expect to see some modification to a 500-year floodplain also.
So, and my question on this is so we won't know the effects on the properties in this West Valley overview, including Fraser Manor, until that's done, until that's modeled and you've got some figures back.
Correct.
Thank you.
Any other questions for staff? Great, so why don't we, hello?
I can respond to your question about the building code. I worked on the last changes to the energy code, and I remember that the site review. The currently pending site review applications were exempted by request of council. I think it wasn't proposed at the time. It was in front of you for a recommendation. And I think I actually got the same question during that meeting on whether or not the site review criteria would still apply. And I said, yes, they do. And they still apply today. So if you find that without imposing higher energy standards, the project doesn't meet the code requirements, you can impose additional energy efficiency requirements.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you, Hella. With that, why don't we turn to the applicant and have a chance to make a presentation?
Trying to find.
And how do I advance it?
With this will go back. And this will
Okay.
advance.
Okay.
Okay.
There we go. Thank you. Good evening. I'm Tim Johnson, and I'm the CEO of Fraser at 350 Ponca Place in Boulder, Colorado. I had the pleasure of speaking to many of you when we presented the concept plan now about 15 months ago. We told the same story, but there are a few changes to it, and there are a few changes to this board too, so we decided it was worth repeating. This is our story in numbers, and it's our road to wholeness and relevance for the next 50 years serving seniors in Boulder. This is a story in numbers similar to what I told you at the planning board, what is now 15 months ago, but it begins before the numbers story. For 2 years prior to September of 2013, when the flood occurred, the Fraser Board of Trustees was engaged in future strategic planning as we looked at what the next 50 years would shape up to be. That plan resulted in us hiring a consultant to help us envision a program for our future, as well as the bricks and mortar that might be required for some of that vision. The process gave Fraser the resolve to face the future by learning from our past, a past which was focused on serving individuals with more of a financial need in addition to the residents that we already serve. Our strategic plan called on us to consider development of affordable housing and a model of delivering services to people in their own homes in the Boulder community well before an inclusionary housing policy of the city mandated it in a development concept for our campus. The plan reiterated at that time that our Fraser campus would continue to be the center of what Fraser as an organization would be. To that end, the plan identified bricks and mortar needs as well as program plans. A master timetable was established at that time. And then the fateful week of September of 2013 occurred. The day after the flood, we awoke to a new reality. We were broken, but in so many ways, we were better than we ever were before the flood. And as an aside, FEMA recognizes us as the largest single disaster in the state of Colorado from that flood event. It is that realization that brings us here tonight. So we start out with our numbers, 57 years of history serving the Boulder community. 20 minutes, the length of time it took the flash flood to ravage chaos on our community. 40% of our revenue, the amount of our annual revenue generation that was lost the night of the flood. 100 residents lost their homes that night, many carried to safety within minutes of the disaster. 16%, the number of residents in our healthcare center, or the percentage of residents in our healthcare center that are on Medicaid. Interesting fact, 14% of the 16% are all non-Fraser residents. So we meet a Medicaid need of seniors in the community. 46 months since the flood and the beginning of the process of becoming whole again. We had wait staff working that were freshmen in college at CU when they began, and they have now graduated from college when we're finally getting this to the planning board. 1,347 square feet. That's the average size of all newly built Fraser apartments since 1970. The average size of the apartments in the new building we are proposing is 1,451, so not a great addition. 54%, the number of residents in our healthcare center that are residents from outside of Fraser, members of the larger Boulder community. 50 years, planning for wholeness and relevance that will take us into the future. Thousands of seniors have called Fraser home over these past 57 years. Thousands of employees have earned their livings, discovered their callings, had their first jobs at Fraser. Thousands of families, fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, cousins, grandmothers, grandfathers have all been part of the Fraser family. 46 months of master planning, designing, and modeling. 4 surveys, resident, waitlist, and 2 community surveys. Hundreds of meetings with residents, resident focus groups, resident councils, board of trustees, consultants, architects, community, employees, one-on-one, and city. Fraser's community benefit closing thoughts. The vision of the Fraser board is that Boulder should be a better place because Fraser is here. That Fraser seeks to impact the aging experience in Boulder. That Fraser will develop programs to deliver services to people living in their own homes in the greater community, Boulder community. And Fraser holds social responsibility as a primary commitment. We are working with Boulder Housing Partners to purchase and develop the Mount Calvary site for senior affordable housing. We're working with other not-for-profit providers of services to seniors to evaluate how we might work together to have a bigger impact in the larger community. And we're working with the City of Boulder Department of Human Resources to explore opportunities to partner and deliver services to other seniors in Boulder. And with that, I'll turn it over to our architect, Greg Dean.
Good evening. My name's Gregory Dean. I'm with Horde Copeland Mott. We are the architects partnered with Fraser in their journey to wholeness. And as Elaine kind of pointed out, a lot of the critical information of the project, I wanted to just give an overall snapshot of the architecture and some of the thought process that's gone into the development of this project so far. This site plan is similar to a graphic that Elaine put up. It kind of highlights the new and renovated areas of the campus. And it also kind of shows the new independent living sitting over top of what is current, or the existing assisted living. So that kind of, if you've been by the site, that gives you the context from a site perspective of what that building's going to cover. Sorry. This is a landscape plan, and the reason I wanted to point this out is we've had the opportunity to work with city staff in looking at the entire site and bringing this to current requirements in terms of street trees and open space and various other landscape requirements. We did focus a lot of attention on Thunderbird Drive, the north-south direction. That is currently and will remain the common use, part of the common use bike path. So we are actually disengaging that from the curb as it exists today, bringing that inboard to the site, and landscaping that and providing that amenity or maintaining that amenity. Just briefly, this is a diagram of the flood defenses that we have been looking at, and again, working with the city staff. And we also engaged Mr. David Mallory to help us plan the defenses that are appropriate for this site. Again, not imposing any adverse effect upstream or downstream. And so it's really about protecting that two-story existing health center building right here, that kind of arch-shaped. And in some of the photos that Elaine showed with the garage going below grade, that's the areas where we're targeting on providing a flood defense measure for that. And again, with the idea of augmenting the emergency evacuation plan. And these drawings here are sections through the various areas where we would be implementing these flood defenses, and it's basically getting gives you an idea of the terrain there, the contours, and these walls where we're going to implement walls are not high walls. I think we're looking at 4-foot high wall as the highest, and then it kind of tapers down from there based on where the flooding occurs, would occur most. Should I continue?
That's time, but if you want to just wrap up the thoughts.
Yeah, just a few more. These are just added images I wanted to do to support what Elaine was talking about. These are views of the new independent living as you're going southbound on Foothills Parkway. Again, just looking back to the west, I know the view corridors are important, and in concept design, we did talk about that and minimizing the impact of that eastern mass along Foothills, but also maintaining a pedestrian type scale as you get closer up to the building. Internal to the campus, just looking at the circulation to provide for the residents. The Bridge Cafe is just to the left of the image there. We saw that one earlier. That's the new addition of the Wellness Center for the aquatics program, but also maintaining a lot of the existing open space. Looking at the front entry and really what we're looking to do is move the entry point onto Ponca instead of Pawnee, and I think that's going to improve the traffic flow along there and reduce some of the blind spots as you come out of Fraser and that circle of Pawnee. And also it starts to integrate the new architecture and the existing, ties that together. There's the Arts and Education Center, gives you an idea of how that will look against the existing building. And finally, just providing that amenities and the spaces for the residents to enjoy what Boulder has to offer. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Dean. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Questions for the applicant? Anyone have any questions? Crystal?
I wanted to ask Mr. Johnson a couple questions. The first one is the EcoPass for your employees. How long have you been doing that, and how long do you?
It is going to begin. It's going to begin in January, I believe. And Leslie Radosi, one of our vice presidents, has more information on that. But if I could clarify just one thing. As we've done our planning, we have used the concept of driverless cars impacting our community by the time this building is built. So one of the messages that we have tried very hard to send to our resident population is that as hard as that is for them to imagine, we are going to be opening up a new building at about a time when they are going to begin to experience the impact of driverless cars. And to that end, we have done a lot of planning operationally as to how we can begin to provide more transportation and do all we can to create ways to encourage our residents to actually give up their cars without giving up their autonomy or their independence. And so it's a combination of eco-passes for all of our employees, to encourage our employees to take other modes of transportation, to reduce the footprint of vehicles on our property and in Boulder, to increase the number of ways that that we provide transportation to our residents, and to encourage alternate modes of transportation as well.
Thank you. And are you going to have electric vehicle charging stations? I might have missed it.
Yes, we will. I think that was part of a requirement of part of that.
And so then I totally appreciated you talking about your social responsibility goals, and I know you're doing the inclusionary housing offsite in partnership with Boulder Housing Partners. And I think you talked about including, or a possibility of including some of the residents in your inclusionary housing at Mount Calvary Lutheran Church site, being able to use some of the amenities here. Could you talk a little bit about that?
It'll be a combination of a lot of things. We are creating what we are working name calling Fraser Solutions, that we will be delivering out to seniors in the community. As a part of that, one large piece of that, will be delivering many of those programs and services to residents that live in the new senior affordable housing development, as well as Highmar and other senior. So it's going to be a combination, but a lot of the services will be delivered to them. Many of the amenities, many of the things, we'll be able to replicate some of those programs for people in those larger congregate settings.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Any other questions for the applicant? Peter?
Hi, you made mention of well in the application.
Yes.
I'd love to hear a bit about that.
So when we have sustainability consultants, Noresco, who are working with us, who we brought on very early in the process to talk about the whole LEED process. And as they talked to us about sustainability, they talked about the building code in Boulder, and that we almost qualify for LEED Silver just building in Boulder. So it was kind of a foregone conclusion that we would build to, I believe, gold. I'll have to refer to our architects. I think the gold certification for that. As they were talking about that, they mentioned a new certification called WELL building certification. And they kind of glossed over it. They said that this is something new in the industry. It's about 3, 4, 5 years old. Nobody in senior living was doing this. That's all they needed to tell me, was that nobody was doing it. And by that, the implication was it's probably not something you'd be interested in. And I stopped the conversation at that point in time, and I said, don't presume for us what we would want or what we wouldn't want. I want to know more information about well. So they did a great job coming back to us with much more information about well, and we were very intrigued by it. Whereas LEED really deals with the building and the built environment, well deals with the people who live and work in the environment, and how do you construct a building that really benefits them. I had an opportunity within about a couple months after that to actually accidentally be in a meeting with Phil Williams, who is the president of Delos, the organization that created the well building standard. And he said, nobody in the senior living industry is doing this, and somebody in the future will, but you ought to know about it today. Well, I just about died waving my hands in the background, in the back of the room saying, we're doing it, we're doing it. And so that connected us to Phil. Phil has adopted this as being one of his projects, and we have made a decision to pursue the WELL standard for the independent living building as well as our arts and education building. And we were just told a few weeks ago that we will be the first arts and education or cultural building in the world to meet the WELL building standard as well. So we're really excited about that.
I think you may be the first in Boulder as well, period.
Does that answer?
Thank you.
Great. Other questions, the board? David?
Sure, I'll just ask about those RTD booklet, ticket booklets. Is that also a program that you're starting up this year or in January, or have you been providing?
I'm going to have to defer to Leslie.
And Leslie, if you could come up and give your name.
Hello.
Good evening. Hi, I'm Leslie Radosi, Vice President of Wellness and Community Services at Fraser. I'm going to have to learn a little bit more about those booklets myself. We do offer some, but I don't know the exact logistics of it. But I did want to speak to your questions about the neighborhood EcoPass for our residents. We did, over the last year, look into that and worked with a gentleman in the city. I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but in order to have a neighborhood EcoPass, you need contiguous neighborhoods to apply for that. And there was a woman resident south of us, in the neighborhood south of us, who was also interested. So she and I worked together with the gentleman at the city to learn the steps for that. And one of the first steps in order for the city to model the costing for that program was to do surveys of your neighborhood. So our neighborhood was our Fraser campus, and we were required to survey all of our independent living residents, and her task was to survey her neighborhood. So we did that, and she had difficulty actually getting enough survey results for her neighborhood to proceed. At Fraser, we got enough survey results. Our residents are always good about responding to surveys. But in working with the gentleman at the city, the data that we retrieved from our surveys, that was essentially we would have very low ridership, partly due to our population. While there's certainly some residents who are eager to get on the bus and travel the city that way, the majority of our residents were less interested in that and more interested in using our own shuttle services and personal transportation that we offer. So in talking with the gentleman at the city, we determined that there really wasn't even a way for him to cost out a model given the low amount of ridership that would be expected from it. So we can certainly always revisit that, but between the two neighborhoods, it was determined we really didn't have the ridership to pursue getting a neighborhood EcoPass for the residents.
Okay.
But if I can just add, whether we have EcoPasses or not, we're really committed to providing significantly more transportation than we have in the past. We understand the environment that we're moving to. We understand the city of Boulder. We really want to be a part of the solution to reducing vehicles and the footprint of not only our campus, but also the city too. So that's something we're very much committed to, whether there's an EcoPass or not.
Yeah, and I actually tried to set one up for my neighborhood, so I'm familiar with that process, and it is very difficult to herd a lot of cats, and especially if you're in a neighborhood where people don't respond and things. But I liked when I saw the 10 booklets of each type that are available, because I know that does provide an alternative when you don't have really high ridership, when there's alternatives to people. So I just was curious. So, but I commend that. That looks like that's a condition in the proposal. So I think that's great. Thank you.
Great. Other questions? So I have one for Mr. Johnson. Sorry, get your steps in today. So I appreciate your raising independently a question I was going to ask you about, which is the autonomous vehicles and rideshare and other tools that are out there. Given that I think there'll be some of that by the time you open, assuming we approve, and certainly plus 5 years, plus 10 years, even more of that. My question is whether there's been planning done for repurposing some of the parking? Because my sense is you're going to be dramatically overparked, and you're spending a lot of money on parking that may be not providing any return to you, to your residents or citizens. So the question is, have you thought about that issue?
We think about it every day, and we think about it especially as we talk to residents today who don't think there will be enough transportation, who frankly have a hard time understanding the concept of what is happening here too. And so would we repurpose? I don't know we'd repurpose, but as the number of residents that have their own vehicles go down, we would begin to do more of our parking in the parking garages that we've got, in the underground parking. And certainly we would look as to how we could claim asphalt and turn it into green space too. That would just be a benefit to everybody. That's kind of future thinking for when we get there, we will do this. We don't know exactly when that will be, but yeah, absolutely.
Great, thank you. With that, seeing no more questions, I think we can turn to the public. Cindy, do we have anybody signed up?
No, sir.
Would anybody from the public like to address the board on this agenda item tonight? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing and turn back to the board for discussion and decision-making. Who'd like to kick us off? Brian?
Well, I think you satisfied my concerns about energy performance by going with the well standard. I think that's a pretty good approach to doing this. And, just in terms of just sharing my thoughts with everyone on the board about why I would suggest going with a higher energy standard that is required on this as a way of meeting our basic site review criteria. I do think it can be rooted back in the fact that the Boulder Valley Comp Plan has changed and has a lot more language in it now in terms of sustainability, resiliency, energy performance, support for renewables, EVSE charging stations, stuff like that. So I think, we could make that argument that in order to come into compliance with the current comp plan, that we might need to do that. But I'm not going to offer a condition to try to make them do the 2017 Boulder Energy Code. But I do think we should make sure that the complying with the well building standard is a requirement of the site review.
Other comments?
Actually, I'll go ahead and make one other comment. I do think that actually, having watched these guys go through concept review and DAB, that they were really responsive to the comments that people had, and I think they've come up with a good, well-designed building, kind of especially the natatorium portions, kind of got a lot of the attention of the DAB folks.
And if I can just follow up on the energy issue as well, I was glad to see the requirement to have the conduit and wiring and other sort of things to make sure you can have it. My guess is the drop in solar prices will have you putting some of that on at some point. So I also am not sure with that well standard that we need to put it as a site review criterion, but I would expect that you'll be doing it and hope that you would be doing it. I'd also say I'm not going to make it a site review criteria, but I do think that kind of planning for what I think is probably over parking would be a good thing, and I appreciate your direction of probably taking out the surface parking and providing more benefit, I think, both for the residents and neighbors, and keeping that parking on site. I'll also say, though, kind of in line with well and our resilience, if you do have that internal space, and a lot of it is protected from a flood perspective, some on-site storage and having some thought about space to put storage in the future for energy will improve your resilience, will probably be an economic value in 5 or 10 years, and is worth just making sure you've got a good space for it. And my guess is you'll have excess parking space, so there's probably a good place where you can repurpose some of that. Peter?
Following on that and not making it a criteria, but something for us to consider going forward as we talk about pre-wiring for solar and parking garages, ways to pre-wire and pre-pipe them for indoor ag and energy storage, being a leader.
John?
Yeah, Crystal.
Okay, I didn't know if you saw me down here.
I didn't, so thank you.
I just wanted to say that I appreciate the applicant and Mr. Johnson and his staff and the architects responding to the numerous issues that we brought up in site review, including some of the flood issues, some of the landscaping issues, because you do have a beautiful campus with a lot of trees around there. And then some of the site corridors and how you cited your buildings. So I definitely appreciate that. And then your social responsibility. Although it contributes to meeting consistency with the Boulder Valley Comp Plan without having community benefits that we could directly attribute it to the site review. I appreciate your bringing those up because I would consider that a community benefit as far as this project goes. So with that, I would like to move to the Planning Board approves use review application LUR 2017-00003, adopting the staff memorandum as findings of facts, including the attached analysis of review criteria and subject to the recommended conditions of approval. And the recommended conditions of approval are listed in our packet. There are 3 conditions. I won't read them, but they're within our packet.
Is there a second? Second from Brian. I just had one quick question. Do we have the right case number on that? Because I'm looking at our packet and I saw 2016-00071.
Yes, I think you're correct, John. It's 7-1 at the end, and there is more than 3 review criteria. I think you were looking at the recommended motion language for the last project, probably, Crystal.
Oh, okay. I was just reading from, I am sorry. Gosh, I was flipping through this. Okay, thank you for pointing that out.
So just to make it easy, can I make it
rescind that.
Okay. It's on page 12 of the packet.
That's the trouble with these. Okay.
You could try reading it from the screen, but I had trouble before with my eyes.
Could you,
But it's not.
Actually, can I, how about I make a friendly amendment
why don't
to
you
yours?
do that?
Which is to substitute the language, motion to approve site review case number LUR 2016-00071, incorporating the staff memorandum and the attached site review criteria checklist as findings of fact and subject to the recommended conditions of approval.
I'll
that work?
accept that as a friendly, because now I've totally lost it on here. But I thought I was doing such a great job reading it, too.
You were.
Okay.
And Brian, you accept that as well?
I accept that.
Okay.
I want to make an additional friendly amendment to require that the project both certify in LEED Gold and WELL standard.
Crystal, do you accept that friendly?
Yeah, I do.
Great, so that's accepted by the original mover and the second. Any other comments or discussion? I'll just say quickly for the record that I found that staff's memo and identification of reasons for both the consistency of the site review criteria and the height modification were convincing and complete, especially with the additional information about some of the height and visualizations and taking a look at those view corridors. So really appreciate that information. Any last discussion or thoughts?
Well, I'll say something for the record that I really like. The new multi-use path, for me, riding on a sidewalk is always less than optimal. So I'm on Thunderbird just riding down the street. So I'm really looking forward to riding closer to the residents of Fraser Meadows. That will be a lovely experience. I was going to try to figure out how it could tie into that bridge, but then I realized there's no space there to build any paths through there. So I guess just coming around that sidewalk to the bridge over Foothills is the way to do it. It would be nice if there were enough space for something, but it's not really practical.
I think that bridge is being rebuilt as a part of the CIP, so.
It's actually the one that's
It's the next one?
It's the next one, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's one of the next ones. It's got some of the same issues. So with that, I'm going to call the question. All in favor of Crystal's motion that was seconded by Brian. please signify by saying aye and raising your hands.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes unanimously. Thank you all. Congratulations. Appreciate all the hard work that went into that, and also all the hard work from staff to get us to this point. So with that, that moves us along to matters from staff and the board. And I'll just offer a quick thank you to staff for thinking on their feet on the first agenda, a public hearing item that we had there. So thanks for the drafting and research on that.
Pleasure.
Are there anything else from members of the board? Crystal?
I do have one thing. Can we talk about the agenda for the Hogan Pancos meeting on August 3rd?
What about it?
Okay, so neighbors have brought up the issue of the start time, the 5 o'clock start time. And as I recall, your response and others' responses have said, well, we have an agenda, we've got minutes and some other things that'll take up some of that time. Is there anything else we could move into that 5 to 6 time? So we start at 6, so people that are coming from work will have the benefit of listening to the staff presentation.
So I think we'll try to move as much as we can into it, but if we're done with those things, I think we start. All of us, most of us are coming from work ourselves. We have 5 o'clock start times regularly for matters with significant pieces. I've asked staff during our agenda meeting yesterday, and they've agreed to pre-post the staff presentation and the application so that people would be able to see it both right before the meeting and as they get here, to provide, I think, a level of transparency and capability that they wouldn't otherwise have. I think we ought to probably think about doing that more regularly. I think it's actually a helpful thing for folks. But I'm not sure I'd want to, if we could finish everything else in a half hour, for example, which is possible because we don't have that much else on our agenda, I'd recommend that we just plunge right in, because I think we're going to have a lot of interest from the public and we're going to get a lot of feedback from them, and I want to make sure we have time to consider that and leave ourselves fresh enough that we could actually have a good discussion and hopefully even get to a decision next Thursday.
Yeah, I know that's how we've done business before, starting early, and but in this case, I made the request to consider a different date. I made it in May, and apparently through the process, whatever process went through, I didn't get a response until the meeting date was actually announced, and then the board decided to go ahead with that meeting date, so that's set. But in this case, this was the second request, and if people want to start at 5, my suggestion would be to start at 5, get through our routine things, maybe pause the meeting and start over at 6.
And I guess my thought is, if I'm going to leave my job early to get here at 5 to accommodate more opportunity for public hearing, and I haven't heard anybody who said that they themselves can't make it by 5. It's always talking about maybe other people can't make it by 5. I don't see a reason to do that and basically take more risk that we're going to be making decisions later in the night when we're not fresh, or have to kick it over into another night. So I personally would be opposed to that, but obviously if that's the
poll of the board,
sure, why don't,
where people are on this.
Honestly, my thought is that I think we've heard a lot more complaints from the public about going late or about continuing things and getting another, having them come twice. So I think we're actually doing the right thing by trying to make it all work on one night under regional hours. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Dave.
Shall I go first? Okay, so I see both sides of the issue. It is a trade-off, and I do agree that the advantages of trying to get to deliberations and not have awkward periods where we can't talk about it are there. And the advantages of getting people home a little earlier are there. So that to me is kind of, as big of an argument as, maybe a few people who might have to miss a bit of the staff presentation. So that's just how I feel right now.
I mean, just let me be clear. I didn't expect anybody to want to change the meeting. I did feel a responsibility to bring it up. And it wasn't an issue of, you've heard that a person couldn't come. It's the issue of they leafleted the neighborhood with our normal expected 6 o'clock time. So my suggestion would be to this board, when we have an opportunity to schedule it, to schedule some time to pay attention to the public participation report that has come out, because there's a number of things that I feel could facilitate a better relationship, a better discussion, starting at the very beginning of the process with neighborhood meetings, et cetera, and how we engage the public at that stage. And you'll see from reading the report that there are certain things that will really jump out at you that are good ideas on how we might change our process. And so I didn't want to let neighbors' comments or community comments go by without bringing this up, because I wanted to make sure that they knew that we had heard it and we had considered it.
And I'll just note, I think we probably should have set the 5 o'clock time when we set the date, because we know this matter gets a lot of interest and a lot of concern. It would have been better probably to do that earlier, so you wouldn't have had the leafleting rated issue out there. And I do think we need to think through, and I've started reading the report and thinking about the report, and we'll continue to do so. So, absolutely, we need to have that discussion in light of our rules, which we've already agreed that we're going to come back and reconsider because they're old, nobody in the public can find them, and nobody knows they're there, and it leaves staff in the awkward position of explaining things that, were written while a lot of us were in high school. So,
Or not born.
And so, I do think we need to take a holistic look at all those things to make sure we're engaging as possible and not have to kind of change things as we go along, which I think is always awkward.
Thank you.
Can I ask you guys, just out of ignorance, I don't know where to find that report. I haven't seen it yet. So where do I?
You know what? It's a little bit hard to find it on the city website. I'll send it to you, but there's, well, I'm just saying you can find it, but it might be easier if I just send you a link. It's public participation or public engagement, working groups. I mean, I checked all those on the city search.
I think I only found it because it was included on one of the weekly planning blasts.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you go and try to find it on its own, it's a trick.
It is a
I'm sending you all the link right now.
It's the second search that comes up in Google if you are as smart as Brian in searching and setting up the search term.
Public Engagement Working Group Report.
Oh, good.
It's the second.
Good, better.
Yeah.
Well, because Google's the only way to find stuff on
Yeah, I searched the city website, which is probably not the best way to find it, but I did find it.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it.
Did you include Boulder in that search?
You didn't?
You did.
So for the sake of completeness, and I think to pick up on Harmon's suggestion and to kind of follow up on Crystal's raising this issue, and I'm glad you raised this issue because I think it's an important one. How many people support the notion of doing everything on the agenda but not starting the Hogan-Pancoast agenda item until 6? Just with a show of hands, so.
I'd be willing to do it, but I don't.
Would it be your preference?
I don't work full-time, so I feel sorry for the people who had to send out extra notices, so I'll vote with Crystal on that one.
Okay, and then how many folks would like to get everything we can done. We'll take the time that we need to do that, and then we'll just move on to Hogan Payne cost when we've covered everything else on the agenda. Just show of hands on that one.
We'll take our bathroom break.
We can take our break, we can fill our plates, we can do all those sorts of things.
Yeah,
So, Armin?
I would just say that if it's 5:50 when we finish our business, maybe we just say we're going to break till 6 and start the main item at 6 o'clock. But if it's 5:30, I think we should just get right into it.
Should give it a 10-minute trigger.
Okay, well, we'll kind of play that by ear to maximize the chances, but I think it sounds like the weight of the board, although not an overwhelming one, is that we'll just keep moving, but not, dive ahead too fast, so. Good, well, thank you. Other matters from either board or staff?
None from staff.
Terrific. Well, thank you all. Thanks for a great evening. It's 8:30, and we'll see you all back next week. Adjourn tonight's meeting.
Less than 2.5 hours.